Hi, and welcome to Inspect and Adapt. This is Mark Griffin, Director of Customer Solutions here at Construx. Founded by Code Complete author Steve McConnell, Construx believes that every software team can be successful. We believe that developing the professional skills of companies, teams, and individuals is the best way to achieve more software success. In a typical episode, we can talk with one of our consultants and explore different types of engagements that they're working on. We describe the issues those engagements are designed to address and how we solve them, and we have some fun along the way. But today, we're going to do a little bit of a departure from that, and we're going to bring you a very special and timely episode that provides a window into this new novel coronavirus world that we all find ourselves in. I'm joined again by Construx CEO Steve McConnell, as well as a new participant today, Construx VP of Consulting, Jenny Stewart. You know Steve's background from prior podcasts, so I will not introduce you again to that, but I will introduce you to Jenny. She has been with Construx for more than 20 years and brings her breadth and depth of experiences to matters of organizational change, process improvement, and software lifecycle assistance. Jenny's expertise in combining agile development and traditional best practices has helped Construx clients dramatically improve their ability to meet their software development business goals. She's a prolific author of white papers and co-author of the Construx Professional Development Ladder, and Construx just wouldn't be the same without her efforts. Streaming to you live. Yeah, that's right. We're actually all streaming to you live from our respective homes, Fremont, Bellevue, Washington, and Sammamish, Washington. So welcome, Steve and Jenny.
Glad to be here, Mark.
So let's begin by talking about today's fascinating topic. Construx, like all other organizations out there today, has had to make adjustments to its business delivery in this quarantine climate. And what we were curious about was what were other software organizations doing to cope with the unprecedented event that we all are living inside right now. So Steve and Jenny came up with this idea of surveying software professionals to determine the effect that work from home strategies have during the pandemic, and what has that effect on software development that they're witnessing. And by the way, at the outset, I'm going to mention that if you would like to get a full copy of the Construx Coronavirus Work From Home Report, please go to the resources section of the Construx website to download it, as well as other excellent free Construx content. So let's start, Steve and Jenny, by having you both tell us a bit about where this idea came from, why you decided this was an important thing to understand, and maybe you can give us a feel for the survey demographics, like who participated, what was the data collected, et cetera.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I have to say it all initiated with Steve. He really had the idea of reaching out to the software community and providing some assistance to understand what people are going through and to be able to gather insights into where people are having successes, where people are struggling, so that we could provide some guidance back to the software development industry. So sorry, Steve.
Yeah, Jenny's being a little too generous, I think. We were talking about what the effect of coronavirus was on our business, and then we started wondering about what it was on other businesses, and then we thought, I think it's the engineering mindset. We thought, well, we could do something useful here. We could actually survey other businesses and find out how they're handling this event, and maybe we would get mundane responses and it would be everything we expected, or maybe we would hear some things that surprised us and we learned something. And so we got kind of excited about that idea and decided that we would try to learn something, and so we put this survey together.
Well, it's cool. I mean, people were, in reading some of the comments, and there were a lot of comments. I think people were quite verbose in their comments, weren't they?
We had over 7,000 comments. So it was a lot of comments to wade through, but there was a lot of good material there. People were sharing their pain, and they were sharing some pride in some of the practices that they developed, and there were a lot of unexpected reports of things people were doing, and I think we in fact did end up learning a lot from those comments.
Yeah, when Steve and I were first talking about this, we obviously talked about having some questions that were, rate on a scale of significant to no impact at all kind of thing. But we really wanted to have a lot of open field optional questions. And in fact, I was really struck by how much of the interesting and insightful information came from the comments, and how thoughtful people were and how many comments they gave us. So for folks who have participated or are out there listening, I really want to thank them for that because it provided a lot of very interesting and useful input.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very generous with their comments and lots of really good insights.
Maybe they were task avoiding. I don't know. So, in looking through it, one of my favorite questions here was the one you asked about the work from home frequency, right? What they did in the past, what would be considered today the normal state, what's the present, and then what's their future thinking about what the work from home strategy might look like. What did we find in that question that was really surprising?
I think this was perhaps the least surprising result of the survey. This pretty much matched what we were predicting, which was the survey found that before the pandemic, the vast majority of people were working from home, infrequently. Most people said infrequently, or the plurality of responses said infrequently. Second most common was sometimes. But we had more responses that were in the never category than in the almost always or almost always category. And then I think I will say I was a little surprised that we had well over 90% of people working from home now. And I guess in our local area, in the Seattle area, that wouldn't have surprised me. But since our survey drew from 63 different countries, I was surprised that we had well over 90% working from home, really globally. And then we saw that based on this experience of working from home, most people personally would prefer to work from home more than they had been before. We had hardly anyone who replied that they never wanted to work from home in the future, whereas we had about 15% that replied never before the pandemic. And we had quite a smaller number, maybe about half, that said that in the future they would prefer to work from home only infrequently, compared to how many they said they worked from home infrequently before all this happened. So we had about 85% that thought that after the pandemic they would like to work from home sometimes, often, or always, or almost always.
One thing that struck me about the data, Steve, was the difference between future personal preference and future team prediction,
Right.
where the team prediction showed a higher amount of people working from home often, but personal preference actually showed a smaller amount of that.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of comments in the narrative comments about, particularly in regard to how work practices had changed. There were a lot of comments that were almost like a virtual asterisk that said, well, of course, we already had some people working remotely. So, I'm speculating here. I'm doing a little bit of interpretation on the data, but my interpretation of that difference between prediction about how much the team would work remotely in the future, which was quite a bit higher than the prediction about future personal preference, was just drawing in that idea that some people on the team already were working remotely even before this started.
It also made me just think about the fact of some of the things that people were missing, like the incidental water cooler conversations, or just that cup of coffee you have with a colleague that you happen to see in a hallway corridor, is something people are really missing.
It definitely seemed to be a theme for sure. And one of the respondents said it would be interesting to conduct this survey every 3 weeks or so. And I doubt we could get people to fill out our lengthy survey that often, but I suspect that there's some truth in that. Speaking for myself, I am definitely not enjoying the work from home or isolation anywhere near as much now as I was a month ago. And I would say the novelty of the virtual cocktail hours is starting to wear off for me. I'm definitely getting some personal fatigue from the video calls. And there are days when I feel like, okay, that's enough video calls. I don't need any more video calls today. Whereas the same amount of face-to-face contact, I think, would be fine. So,
Right.
I don't know how, Jenny, you're feeling about that, but it's I do think time counts in this issue.
I think time counts as well. I haven't yet reached fatigue just because I don't typically have, that many calls, but I do have friends who are telling me things like, I have 5 or 6 Zoom sessions every day, and I am getting really tired of all of this.
Indeed.
I thought one interesting feedback point on the survey was what had happened with the daily stand-ups. And I think most teams said they were just doing their daily stand-ups via video. But I'd say we had probably 3-to-1 in terms of teams that had decreased the frequency of the daily scrum versus those that had increased the frequency. And I was not surprised to see some people reporting that they had decreased the frequency to 2 or 3 times a week. But I will say I was surprised to hear some people report that they had increased the frequency to 2 or 3 times a day.
Yeah, that's quite the shift.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things you opened up the survey with, Steve, was a sort of a top level comment about the level of disruption that people had seen in terms of both personal stress and work-related stress. And it seemed like the personal stress took the lead on that.
Yeah, this was really Jenny's brainchild, I think, was, in Jenny's work with our clients, she had heard companies saying that, there was some stress related to or disruption related to working from home per se, but there were other kinds of disruptions that were coming out of just changes in work priorities. Some projects were being shut down, other projects were being elevated. There was a lot of firefighting going on. So we wanted to get a handle on the degree to which the disruptions were caused by the change in work location or just everybody working remotely versus other factors. And we threw in the question about personal stress related to coronavirus almost as an obligatory entry in the responses. And I certainly didn't anticipate that being number one. But when we got the responses back, interestingly enough, in the survey, this question was almost at the end of the survey. So people had a chance to answer numerous questions about the effect of working from home on their Scrum teams and their Kanban and meetings and social interactions. And then we asked this question about how would you rate the relative level of disruption? And even after essentially prompting people to think about all the possible challenges in their work environment, personal stress related to coronavirus bubbled up very clearly to the number one spot. So, I think it's a good sanity check in that, we did the survey mainly to try to get a handle on more kind of work practices. But the backdrop on all this really is it's an extraordinary time where people are feeling personal stress related to their personal safety, their families' health, and because of that, the work issues are in some sense secondary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good cue, I think, to leadership, right? That they should understand the fact that it's not just work-related issues that might be driving things that they're seeing in their teams or their individuals. Is that the personal stress is something that should certainly be aware of, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the podcast. So one of the other things I think you mentioned was that you were actually encouraged by some people choosing to use this pandemic time as a learning experience. So tell me a little bit about that. What did you uncover in that situation?
There's certainly a theme there of just being thrown into the situation, and a lot of people learning new skills in terms of how to use the tools, how to conduct virtual meetings. Well, lots of comments about how that will carry over into the future. I personally find it's kind of interesting. A friend of mine sent me an article whose headline was basically the goal is to arrive alive. Initially, it's talking about, flying with small children, and your goal is really just to arrive with everybody alive. But it also talked about how that sort of impacts the coronavirus world as well, too. And there's almost sort of two camps of people. The people who are supposed to take this as a chance to learn a lot of new stuff and try new skills, maybe learn Spanish or something like that. And then there's the people where the goal is just to arrive alive on the other side of all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is that, I see a lot of the engineering mindset here where, engineers like to solve problems. So, and I think problem solving can be a way to deal with stress and, the whole idea of wanting to figure out how to get through it. I think that's a good coping mechanism for people who have an engineering mindset. I think I was quite struck by the creativity in some of the solutions that people described to us. it doesn't seem like this is just serviceable, workmanlike, utilitarian responses that are trying to get the job done in the short term. I think, there actually is some creativity and even fun in some of the responses. And I think that was heartening to see.
Absolutely.
Definitely some making lemonade out of lemons here.
Absolutely. So let's talk about more detail as we go through the report here about some categories we used in the survey, and just touch on some of the responses. I know it's so hard when you had 7,000 people talking about 7,000 responses to culminate that into one little soundbite. But let's give it a shot with some of the broader categories, like first of all, the notion of communication and connectivity. That was certainly going to be an issue, right? Where people normally are in an office environment, and now they find themselves having to work through a different communication channel. So talk a little about maybe tools and learning curves, and certainly things that we've seen as well in our interactions with different companies.
Yeah, I think the tools are an interesting one. It's from the responses that we got. It sounded like a lot of companies already had Teams. The new adoption of tools was basically a little bit higher for Zoom than it was for Teams, and nothing else really registered. There were very minor responses on Hangouts, Skype, WebEx, but really Zoom and Teams were the two 800-pound gorillas in terms of new adoption. In terms of actual usage, we got many comments along the lines of, we already had Teams, but people weren't really using it, and now usage has exploded. And I think that the way I'm viewing this, and I think I'm viewing it this way partly because of what we saw in the responses to the survey, is that we've essentially had this forced learning experience where you never could have gotten the whole country to, or really the whole business world, to adopt remote communication technology over the space of a couple weeks. But that's effectively what's happened, is everyone has been forced to learn it, and not just technical people, but all of the business partners and stakeholders and customers. And so I think that's really interesting, just in that we've just had massive wide-scale adoption of these tools. And to me, I think one of the interesting aspects of that is, I think technical people like to learn new tools, so that's a treat really for them. But for other people who may view learning a new tool as threatening, there's actually been something disarming about having everyone learning the new tool at the same time. I think people who aren't that tool savvy have been more comfortable asking questions, more comfortable expressing their lack of familiarity with the tool. And I think that's all accelerated the learning curve. So I think that's actually a pretty cool development.
I agree with that. I
Absolutely.
think it's a really interesting time to just see such a huge shift so quickly. One of the things I found really interesting in the survey data was just how communication has shifted. So there's obviously people doing a lot more video conferencing and becoming a lot more comfortable with those tools and using them more. But a lot of the respondents also talked about other communication changes that had happened, team members putting more effort into their written communication, meetings being better planned and staying more focused, unnecessary meetings being reduced. So just this whole idea that it's not just video, but communication in totality has changed through this period of time. And I think that it's going to change a little bit forever. It'll be really interesting to look back in 6 months and a year and say, what of these learnings that we're going through now have just become a part of normal business life?
Yeah, I think the meetings topic is a particularly interesting one, just because under normal circumstances, meetings are a huge sore point for practically everyone, and especially in large organizations. Technical staff tends not to like meetings because they interrupt their day, and they don't necessarily feel they get a lot out of them. Leaders in organizations tend not to like meetings because their day is booked wall to wall with meetings, and we've heard for years that the only time leaders ever get anything done is like after 6 or before 7 or that kind of thing, because of the wall to wall meetings. And I think in addition, we've for years heard just huge frustrations about how poorly run meetings are, how there's no agenda for the meeting, people who get invited to meetings who don't really need to be there, just an endless litany of frustration about meetings. And so to me, it's very interesting that, one of the most frustrating aspects of working in a business, which is meetings, actually still needs to continue during the pandemic. But that's the thing that has probably been transformed the most. And so a lot of the responses were about meetings. And I thought it was interesting. I think we had, we asked about coordination and working with stakeholders. We didn't really ask a question specifically about, have your meetings improved or gotten worse? I mean, for me, it wasn't on the radar screen that meetings might actually improve because of this. But we had a lot of people who said that the meetings had gotten better, that they were more purposeful, they were better planned out in the first place, they didn't last as long, they stayed on topic more. So that to me was a really surprising outcome.
And all good things if we can keep it into the future.
Yes,
absolutely. Being more deliberate with when you need to call meetings. I mean, we certainly went through in the beginning, getting established with a rhythm of different times of meetings. I mean, Steve, I think you tried to keep to some level of normalcy with regards to Construx and having, say, Wednesday lunch or wind downs or things like that. And I think we've also been instructed to try and get better microphones, better webcams. Clean up the background of our offices, hypothetically speaking. In my case,
well,
this is audio only, right?
yeah. Absolutely.
I find it's interesting, right? So one of the things I've learned is my microphone actually has really great quality, but it's somewhat uncomfortable to wear, and so I went up to try and get a new one, and in late March, the timeline to get a new headset was at least a month out. And some places were literally just saying, don't know, right? So we had a massive run on all of those materials. And I think if you weren't able to be in the first pass of getting it, you potentially had a lot of issues trying to work from home with, a poor microphone or a poor webcam or a computer that wouldn't even allow you to have video or that kind of thing.
Right.
Yep. I think we as a company were, we had already made sure everybody was set up to do video conferencing before all this stuff started. So I don't think our company was super affected by it, but in terms of not being able to get the equipment that we need. But yeah, I think other people have. In terms of the survey, I don't think we got a single comment from anyone saying, I didn't have the right technology, I have been unable to get the right technology, which is pretty interesting. We had, over 600 people who responded on the survey and over 7,000 comments, but not one about an equipment shortage. So, we certainly had comments about people being frustrated with the quality of, say, other people's microphones or other people's webcam images,
right?
Other people's internet connections. We had some comments about people being frustrated with their own internet connections, but nothing about just being unable to get equipment. I suspect in the software world that most people already had the equipment, and if not, they at least had a laptop with a camera or that kind of thing.
Sure.
Yeah, I think you could at least muddle through, but right, we're always going to complain more about other people's images than ours because we're not necessarily going to see the issues when our connectivity is low.
Right.
So,
yeah, indeed.
I think it's all an interesting, though, easily solvable problem, right? Once things settle back in, making sure that everybody's got a setup at home that allows them to work, at least in countries that have all the infrastructure, right? I still feel for countries like India, where you'll have whole areas of Bangalore where you're going to have great connectivity and whole areas where you're just not going to have great connectivity.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, I think it's worth contextualizing this in the saying that, yes, there have been challenges and issues, but in terms of our survey, the bottom line is that most respondents said that remote communication was working better than expected or far better than expected. So yeah, there have been challenges to overcome, but that doesn't mean it's not actually working quite well.
And it was surprising to hear that it was working better than expected.
Well, this is a good bridge, I think, into in the survey we break out sort of three levels of experiences that we saw represented. That would be personal or individual experiences, team level experiences, and then leadership or company level experiences. So, why don't we talk about the personal experiences, the individual experiences that respondents shared with us, some of the challenges and benefits that they saw in doing that. We just touched a fair amount on the home office setup. But, like anybody else, you have a home office environment, you're going to have the environment you're in, right? So dogs and kids and, the behavior of, like, I have to remember I'm on video, so, wear pants or whatever, some strange, interesting life guidance you give yourself. So
I think, I think the responses here were probably not super surprising, because by the time we completed the survey, we had all participated in so many of these video calls that we had personally experienced a lot of the issues. So the idea of dogs barking in the background, or people getting interrupted by kids, or having bandwidth issues because you've got three people in the house who are doing, two people working and one person doing online classroom or something like that. I think a lot of people have personally experienced this, or having an old, slow computer at home, or a small, uncomfortable screen, or that kind of thing. So to me, I don't think I was terribly surprised by that. I think one thing that did jump out at me was just the ergonomics of the home office setup, where there's a difference between working at home for a couple hours in the evening versus working, 8+ hours a day. And so we got comments about uncomfortable chairs, uncomfortable desks, and just the idea that working for a couple hours is not the same as a full work day.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also found really interesting the comments around separating work and home life. And I've definitely personally experienced this, right? I don't have that experience now of getting up and having a coffee, and then for me going to catch the bus to go to the office, right? My commute now is grabbing my coffee and walking into the home office. But it's not as clear when home starts and home ends anymore. And those lines can blur pretty easily, and a lot more easily. And we had a lot of people talking about that, and a lot of people talking about trying to have something where they built a new structure into this new ecosystem so that they had a little bit more demarcation. Or was it easier for them to sort of separate, when am I working and when am I not working?
And my reaction to that was actually probably not a typical software person reaction, because this is an issue that authors talk about a lot. And so, I've actually, over the years as an author, read quite a bit on the challenges that authors have motivating themselves when they are working from home, because that's what most authors do. They work from home. And so it was very interesting to me to read participants talking about challenge of, how do I make myself actually do work? An awful lot of people recommended structuring their work days and saying you can't just get up in your pajamas and work whenever you feel like it. It works best to treat it as though you're, in your normal work schedule. So I thought these were pretty interesting, because among authors, this sort of dialogue has been common for eons, and the idea of the difficulty of motivating yourself and structuring your workday is something that a lot of us have thought about for years. I think the advantage that people have in the current circumstances is that they're not trying to do it solely on their own. And being an author is normally a solitary activity where you don't have anybody else scheduling a meeting that you need to show up for at 9 a.m. or adding any structure to your workday. So I think one thing that's probably helping in this circumstance is the fact that we do have these video meetings, and especially for teams that have a daily scrum, they have to at least get their day started by the time the daily scrum happens. And so, yeah, I definitely found it interesting. I think we had many, many, many responses about the challenge of separating work and home life. And then I thought also, there was a clear divide in terms of being able to work effectively at home between the people who have young children at home and people who don't. That seemed to be other distractions. People really described working through. They described I had to make it clear to my roommate or my boyfriend or whatever that when the door's closed, I can't be interrupted. But young children seem to be the disruption that was maybe the hardest to overcome, particularly because in current circumstances, so many people are also trying to provide schooling for their children who otherwise would be in school. So
Yeah.
I guess I think it's good that this part of it's that the most disruptive actually in the long term probably is the part that will not be an issue, because kids eventually will go back to school, and then that'll not be the issue it is right now.
Right. Well, I
Or
think
at
the
least for
Facebook memes are certainly helping everybody feel the pain, the shared pain, and you have to laugh at it because it's, it just is, it is out there. It's people trying to lock themselves away from their kids and things like that. It's a little crazy.
Yeah, I think one of the early Facebook memes I saw within the first week or so was a parent who said homeschooling report period, or homeschooling report : both students suspended, teacher fired for drinking during the workday.
Yes, I think that one resonated with a lot of people for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about personality types, right? If you're familiar with Myers-Briggs and you have this notion of the extrovert introvert boundary, I find myself leaning towards the extrovert side. ESTJ is my branding, but I also have an introvert side that comes up that's fairly present. And I think in a generalized sense, developers tend to be somewhat introverted. And so I think that the adjustment for them in this scenario is probably something not too hard to do. But if you're an extrovert and the only conversation you might have is via Zoom or something like that, it's hard to settle that down and feel comfortable in that environment where you really you take energy from being around people. And if they're not there for you, that's a hit.
It's funny. I have a friend who calls this time the time of the introvert, right? And she's still quite happy without any connectivity other than what she does for work. And then there's folks, Mark, like you and I, who are more extroverted, where I need to schedule social time.
Right. And
I think one thing that came through in the survey responses clearly is that as in everything else, people are different, and so we have a mix in the software world of introverts and extroverts. We have a mix of how much social contact people want or need. We found some people, I think, for whom working at home has been a relief. We find other people for whom working from home has been more of a trial. And I think, if you think about it, that's not too surprising that different people would react differently. And I'm sure we'll have people who are kind of sorry to have to go back to the office when this is over, and we'll have other people who just can't wait to get back. And I do think the software world trends a little bit more introverted than extroverted, and probably definitely more introverted than the general population. There's actually some research on that. It's not terrifically reliable research, but some. So yeah, I think it's possible that this whole work from home period has had less of an impact on software people than it has on the population at large.
Well, I will have to say the survey is very clear that people are not going to be excited about returning to commuting.
That's a big one. Absolutely.
Considering that we didn't mention any of these issues in terms of prompts in the questions. We didn't ask about self-motivation. We didn't ask about blending work and family life, and we certainly didn't ask anything about commuting. But we had dozens and dozens and dozens of responses about ins and outs of commuting, and that's clearly another sore point. And I was struck by the sense of surprise in the responses, by people being surprised that, hey, I've got all this time now. I can sleep in, and I can still start my day earlier, and I can still re-engage with my family at the end of the day earlier. It's like magic. I just suddenly got all this extra time from somewhere, all due to not having a commute. Right.
You fill it up with the extra 2 meals a day you eat now. So it's, unfortunately, I think after 5 weeks, my weight is finally stabilized, which is,
I don't think we had any comments about eating too much, but we had many recommendations about make sure you get up and go outside and exercise regularly. So I think we got the flip side of that.
Yep, absolutely. So let's jump to the second level of experiences, and that's at the team level experience for working.
Yeah.
From
So
home.
can we? I wanted to make one other comment about the commute,
Sure.
about one of the most surprising responses, and it goes back to the meeting topic, where it was really interesting to me to hear people say that they'd been frustrated prior to all this with meetings not starting on time. And I would say, in our experience working with a lot of different companies do have different meeting cultures. And in some companies, meetings start 5 minutes past the hour. Some they start 15 minutes past the hour. I worked at one company a long time ago where meetings routinely started 30 minutes past the hour. And I would actually go into the conference room on time because I knew I'd have 30 minutes to work uninterrupted before anyone
Wow.
showed up. That's the
Ouch.
extreme. But we got comments from people saying our meetings now start on time because people aren't late due to traffic. They're not late due to their bus being late or their train being late. And so to me, the intersection of the commute issue and the meeting issue, where the result is, hey, our meetings actually can start on time now, was pretty interesting.
Well, some of that could be people with small kids at home trying to escape. Let me talk to an adult, please.
I also thought some of the shifts in meeting practices, like making sure that meetings ended at 5 minutes before the hour so that people could, take a quick break, have a coffee or water before joining their next Zoom meeting. So just finding patterns that also helped people make sure those meetings were on time.
Yeah, as you both know, one of my pet peeves for a long time has been the default in Outlook to a meeting being an hour, which I think is probably wasted billions of hours by meetings being scheduled to take an hour that could have been done in half an hour or 30 minutes or 15 minutes. I would love to see a change so that the default meeting length was 15 minutes instead of an hour. And similarly, I think, this idea of meetings starting at 5 minutes past and ending at 5 minutes before the half hour or 5 minutes before the hour is that's a practice that predated pandemic, but is one that if you have to go straight from one video call to the next and you don't even have to change rooms for the meeting, it becomes important to insert some kind of break in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let's talk about the team experience. And we asked some questions, particularly about interactions of individual contributors on their team, and talked to folks about how their interactions with other roles in the organization were happening. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
One thing that really struck me in the team section was about the experience that had shifted for people who had been working from home before all of this. And all of a sudden, everybody is suddenly now experiencing their situation. And so this feeling that there was much more of a level playing field, or that it put everybody on the same footing, or now other people kind of feel their pain and their experience. I thought that was a really interesting, I figured that thread would be there, but it was interesting to me just how strong that theme was.
Yeah, this was an area where I didn't really see a lot of surprises. I think that people reported that the working relationships were, on average, slightly more challenging. I guess that's pretty much what I expected. It wasn't the same. When we did have a lot of people who said the same, but on average, the response was slightly more challenging, really across the board. And some relationships were harder than others. The business partner relationship and the stakeholder relationship were the ones most often described as significantly more challenging. But the interesting thing to me is the one that was described as slightly more challenging the most often was with their own team members. And I interpret that really as just frequency of interaction. These are the people they have to interact with a lot. And so they already know how to interact with them. They already have face-to-face relationships established. And so the remote aspect of it just makes it slightly more challenging. Whereas, there were comments about, I actually have to physically go stalk one of my business partners or my stakeholders, and I can't go physically track them down now. And, if they weren't picking up the phone before, now they certainly aren't picking up the phone. So I guess that response made sense to me.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it seems to be. I mean, the respondents seem to be pretty normal across that. If you look at the graphs you published in the report, it really seems to be a commonality across there. Mm-hmm. What about things like for team members, the physical home environment and availability kind of questions, separating work life, and people having to understand what other folks now are dealing with, right? You maybe not, you didn't know that maybe a coworker had their parents living with them or had young kids in the house or some other challenges they have to do with. So that kind of came out of that survey, right?
That was a really unexpected outcome for me, was the idea that that the remote work mode actually increased the feeling of humanity across a team, where people commented on, we can see their posters on their walls, we can see their collection of soccer jerseys, we can see photos of their family, we can hear their kids' names in the background. And so to me, that's completely unexpected, that being remote all of a sudden would actually increase the degree to which you get to know other people on your team.
The other theme that really came out was that having this be a shared experience together, bringing teams closer. So on that humanity front, just checking in with people more often about how they're doing, how their family is doing, how maybe their grandparents are doing. Having more social breaks, scheduling a social activity together where it really is just a planned social time for the team to hang out and spend time together. People rising to the occasion and helping each other out, a real shared interest in the business ecosystem and how the business change is impacting everybody, and wanting to be there and support that together as a team. So, times like this, I think, are very bonding.
Yeah, and I think the learnings going forward were really useful in this category as well. The idea that people have discovered that it's better to have everyone working from home than to have a mix. And so, going forward, encouraging teams to have everyone work from home on the same days so that they're more on an equal footing if they're not all working from home on a full-time basis. The idea that, if you're going to have anybody on a video call, it's better to have everybody one-on-one on the video call than to have some people sharing a microphone in a conference room and other people having their own mic and their own camera and so on. And then I think for me, the whole idea of setting clear expectations about availability. When can you be interrupted? What is your work? What are the hours of your work day? Going back to that separation between home life and work life, making sure everybody on the team knows, when does each team member's work day start? When does it end? Is it okay to call them on the phone? I think that expectation setting, I don't think it's hard to do, but it seemed like from the responses we got, it wasn't being done all that often. But I think that's an important lesson learned going forward, is just give people some support in separating their work day and their personal day, and consider having everyone work from home at the same time when they work from home.
Right.
And Earl and I have talked for a long time about that idea of teams being 100% virtual, even if they're not 100% virtual, where that dynamic of there are 3 or 4 people in a room and then a couple people virtual just means that people aren't on a level playing field. And that theme came out so strongly here that I think it's a clear pattern that we can use into the future.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the collaborative work idea. How does it work best? I mean, one of the things I think that also came out, I remember reading some of the comments about the more complex communication forms, things where you normally would have a bunch of people in a room brainstorming or whiteboarding. That's a little more difficult in this environment, right?
A little?
Yes.
I think it was pretty clear that anything that is either large groups of people or anything that's highly, highly collaborative, story mapping, brainstorming, design activities, has been harder for people to do virtually.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting finding too, that the pedestrian communications in some ways improved because of having a better planned meeting or that kind of thing. So in some ways, pedestrian communications got better, but the complex communications became more challenging. You can't have 4 people all talking at the same time. It's harder to have side conversations, which, depending on the kind of meeting you're running, maybe you want side conversations in some of those if you're doing collaborative work or brainstorming or doing a whiteboard session. We had, I think, a pretty good set of reports of communications that people found challenging. Large group meetings, as Jenny mentioned, teams that had friction before the pandemic started. And
Sure.
if you have good face-to-face relationships when it started, then that maybe carries you through a long period of working remotely. If you didn't have good relationships, if you had friction, then that seemed to be problematic. More mundane, if the team just hadn't been together very long and you're trying to form a new team remotely, that was reported as challenging. And then Jenny mentioned at the beginning of the podcast the idea of incidental communication, the water cooler conversations, and so on. And yeah, I've been impressed with the creativity that people reported in terms of just setting up an open meeting for an hour that people could drop into, or having virtual cocktail hours, or that kind of thing. I think there have been some really good workarounds here, but I think the general sense on the incidental communication was that they were workarounds. They're not a real substitute for the real thing.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us, I think, to the third level experiences. And, Steve, you wrote More Effective Agile as a guide, a handbook for leadership, and spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about leadership in the last couple of years. The leadership experience in this work from home era, there's some interesting things that come out of that. Do you want to share some things from the survey in that respect?
Yeah, I think the comments that came through in the survey about leader activities had nothing to do with technical practices. It was all about essentially how to do leadership 101 in a remote environment. So, like, one thing that jumped out at me was the comments about you have to find a way to look after your team's emotional needs, especially during this particular time. And I think it's easy to see why that would matter now. But I think going forward, after this is all over, the idea that you just can't ignore the emotional component when people are working remotely, I think, is an important learning that needs to persist after this period. One of the recommendations was support and encourage communications within the team. So, we've talked a lot about all the good ideas that people have had and the good communication practices, but those aren't necessarily happening on their own spontaneously in every team. And so part of the leader's job is actually to make sure that communication is still occurring in a team that's working remotely. There can be a need for increased coordination, to some degree, coordination within the team, but also to a large degree, the coordination challenge that becomes more difficult is across teams. So if you have larger projects and you're not in day-to-day contact with another team that you coordinate with, getting that set up as it ends up being something. And then I think just the idea of the leader being visible and accessible and approachable is another one that's I think really interesting, challenging when you're working remotely. And I was impressed at the sensitivity that the leader responses showed. We had many comments along the lines of, I like to manage by walking around and I can see whether people look like they're interruptible or not. I don't like interrupting people when they look like they're concentrating. So I'll focus on people who look like they could use a break or, are distractible. And remotely, I can't tell who's interruptible and who's not. I thought that was really sensitive kind of a consideration. Another really interesting subtlety I thought was it's impossible to have a lightweight, casual conversation with staff members about a topic because I have to schedule the time to talk to them. Every topic seems important, even if I don't want to make a big deal of it, even if I don't want it to seem important, because I'm scheduling a time to talk about it, they're going to think it's important. And it's hard to just bring something up casually that you want to mention, but that you don't want to make a big deal of. So, these more subtle kinds of communications, I think, end up being a challenge. But I guess I was heartened to read that leaders were actually thinking about this. And I think we didn't mention the fact that our survey respondents were disproportionately weighted toward leaders. I think we had about a third of the respondents that identified either as executive or manager in the responses, and so I think we had pretty good representation of that category.
Absolutely.
I found it also interesting, just the kind, it's not surprising, but just to illuminate the kinds of conversations that they found to be most challenging, right? So things like mentoring people who are more junior, which is obviously going to be harder to do when you need to schedule meetings, as Steve was talking about. Obviously onboarding new staff, that's a whole different ballgame in a virtual world than onboarding staff when you've got all the patterns and you're all in the office together.
Right.
And of course, things like, confronting performance issues or conflict resolution become significantly more challenging in a virtual world. We need to start finding ways to do that are potentially different than how we've done them before.
That's true. So, how about another big topic? And Jenny, maybe you can weigh in on this as being one of our service practitioners here at Construx, and that's the effect on specific technical practices. I mean, a lot of the world is agile for sure. So you have things like Scrum events and Kanban and SAFe. And so why don't you talk a little bit about what you've experienced in your own situation, helping teams in that sense?
Sure. Well, from survey results, not surprisingly, people are saying that all of the events are, somewhat challenging or significantly more challenging for them to do. On the Scrum side, the one that was the easiest appears to be the daily Scrum from what people were saying, but things like sprint planning and backlog refinement, we have people saying things like, 40 some odd +% are finding it to be somewhat more challenging or significantly more challenging. So again, to that conversation that Steve was having earlier about, mundane communication is certainly relatively easy, but anything that's a little more complex is a little more challenging. I think we see that showing up in the Scrum events. We should see that showing up in the Kanban events. And we also asked about SAFe, and not surprisingly, one could expect that things like the SAFe PI planning is reported by people as being the most challenging thing to try and do remotely and virtually. Back to that conversation about complex communication or large group communication is just much more complicated to do virtually.
Yeah, things like big room planning, right? I mean,
Yep.
It's hard to look at 60 little squares in Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was striking that, given the number of respondents we had, that for a couple of the SAFe activities, no one said it was easier. You kind of expect there to be some representation of easier, but for a couple of the activities, it was no one said that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's
true.
And
I mean, some of it, I'm even surprised that anybody said it was significantly less, right? Like, the inspect and adapt, I would have expected to be somewhat similar, but some people were saying that it was actually significantly less challenging, which actually startled me. I would think that given the number of people that you're bringing together for inspect and adapt and for PI planning, that people would struggle more with that.
Yeah, we had such a small number across the board that said anything was significantly less challenging. It makes me wonder if it's like the same handful of people on every question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. Do you see any evidence from folks saying that just the basic processes that you use in these different practices take longer? Was there any sense of that, or were things more or less the same? I mean, bigger communications for sure are going to take longer, but
I think, to me, the overwhelming reaction was, we've spent some time talking about the interruptions and merging work life and home life, but there was a huge theme about overall, there are fewer interruptions. And again, I think it goes back to whether there are young kids in the house or not, but we had lots of people who said, coding's easier, I can concentrate, I'm not constantly being interrupted by my teammates or by other stakeholders who are wandering by my desk. And, I think that based on this, the volume of comments, we had a very large number of comments really on both sides, people talking about interruptions and people talking about their greater ability to concentrate for extended periods. So I think based on just the comments, it would be hard to settle the issue of which was better. But the way I settle the issue is if we look at the overall bottom line reaction, do you think you're going to be working from home more in the future after this or less? We had so many more people who thought they would be working from home more after this, or that they wanted to, their personal preference was to work from home more. to me, that settles it to say that all things considered, they feel like they're getting more done, being more productive, working from home than they were at the office. And I think, so to kind of bottom line the whole survey, I guess the way I would characterize it is, I think the problems that people thought they were going to have did in fact turn out to be problems. So all the problems were as expected. But I think that there were offsetting benefits that were unexpected that actually turned out to be, as great or greater than all the problems that they already knew about. And so the surprise in this, I think, is not that there are disruptions or challenges. We all knew that going in. I think the surprise is that the workarounds and the offsetting benefits are as significant as they are, and may in fact be more significant than the challenges.
Mm-hmm.
I think one could certainly see a shift into the future where some of the more, an average day in the life of a Scrum team has a lot more people working from home, but the activities where we need things that are more complicated or complex, or we really have a larger group of people having a dialogue, those are the times where we all say it really makes sense to make sure that we're together in person to do that.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. So, Steve, you're always a good straight man, and with your comment about bottom lining here, one of my favorite parts of the survey report that you wrote was a section called long-term recommendations for working from home based on the findings. I mean, it's almost unfair to ask you guys since there was so much detail and so much information in this thing, but maybe you can give us some parting wisdom, some thoughts on some of these recommendations for each of the areas we touched on, maybe as a closing comment.
Sure. I think, we do have a section in the report on long-term recommendations. And I think, this is really why Jenny and I wanted to do this report in the first place, was we really wanted to see if there was a way to take advantage of this as a learning opportunity. And in fact, I think that we have been able to take advantage of it as a learning opportunity. We've seen that we have recommendations for individuals that are pretty much what you would expect in terms of internet bandwidth and ergonomic setup, office setup at home. But I think there are some other aspects that are maybe not expected, such as how to motivate yourself and how to structure your workday and how to preserve both your work life and your home life. In terms of the recommendations for teams, I think we did not know a lot of these insights going into the survey, and we actually learned quite a bit in terms of what kinds of team activities work remotely, but what kinds of team activities really you should favor face-to-face in-person interactions for. And then in terms of recommendations for leaders, I think similarly, to me, I think it was eye-opening just that the very idea that a leader needs to adapt to leading remotely, and that you should consciously think about, what do I need to change if I'm leading remotely? That really was not on my radar screen going into the survey, but it's very much on my radar screen coming out of the survey. So I think that we came up with some actually good outcomes.
I see a potential executive summit topic in the future, Steve.
There you go. The shameless promotion group.
Right.
Speaks. All right. Excellent. Well, this has been a great conversation, both of you. Clearly a lot of really encouraging news about how we're all coping with this. I'm seeing my producer with a little wavy hand in the window saying it's time to wrap. So I just want to say thank you both, Steve and Jenny. This has been really, really fascinating. It's a great survey, and I think it's a really interesting look at the world we find ourselves in right now.
And don't forget, the full report will also be available if you want to dig in and see more details about things like tool usage or the specific response rates to different practices and different questions that we asked.
Right.
Absolutely.
That'll be available on the resources part of our website. Absolutely.
So I think our listeners probably feel some comfort and maybe some commonality in hearing how much we are accomplishing. I think it's, if anything, we try to accomplish today in terms of giving information from the survey, that's certainly something that should be a good takeaway for those folks. So be sure to tune in again for another episode of Inspect and Adapt, the Construx podcast. Until then, this has been Mark Griffin as your host. Liz Ostaszewski will be our podcast post-recording audio engineer, and she's going to definitely earn our stripes today with 3 different audio feeds that she has to blend. Devin Musgrove has been our producer. Please continue to stay safe, everybody, and have a great next sprint. If you enjoyed this episode and you have comments or would like to talk with one of our practitioners, reach out via email using comments@construx.com. Again, that's comments@construx.com. We'd love to hear from you.